Harvard Business Review. When populists rise, economies usually fall. Extensive research has shown right and left-wing populists both lead to lower stock returns and higher inflation. Here's why and what businesses can do. By Roberto Stephen Foy and Rachel Kleinfeld, October 10th, 2024. Summary. Business leaders are quick to abhor left-wing populism, with its government giveaways to supporters, spending on boondoggle projects, and disregard for financial discipline and investor confidence. They are more likely to see right-wing populists as the safe variety and can be conflicted about whether and how to oppose them. But new research shows that right-wing populism negatively affects stock returns. And the problem gets worse the longer populist leaders are in power. Executives need to take these risks seriously and learn how the rise of a right-wing populist affects credit and currency stability, talent acquisition and retention, investor confidence and asset flows, and the very ability to run and grow a business. By 2020, Sultan Vargas Media Company was generating 66 million a year from nearly 45 titles, mostly women's magazines and lifestyle brands. But he operated in Hungary, and doing business in the country was getting much more difficult. The government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban had just blocked a potentially lucrative merger of his online business. Was it because one of his outlets was a political website? He had recently received two offers to buy the company, even though it was not for sale. He had heard stories of other businesses getting squeezed by regulation, tax investigation, or forced sales to political insiders. Was this what he was experiencing? Would he, like other Hungarian business people, end up quietly selling his company and leaving the country? Hungarian entrepreneurs had initially thought of Orban as a populist of the safe variety. His campaigns were socially divisive, but he also emphasized good governance, market reform, and private sector growth. Orban's populism was not the fire-breathing variety of the left, like Venezuela's Hugo Chavez or Argentina's Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, whose reckless economic measures sent credit risk soaring, undermined investor confidence, and trashed national currencies. Rather, it was populism of what some felt was a more tolerable right-wing style, dabbling in polarization for the sake of winning elections, but sticking to sensible pro-business policies after, or at least so it seemed. Vargas' dilemma in Hungary illustrates a more general point for businesses the world over. While companies generally revile populists of the left, when it comes to those who claim to be pro-business, their feelings are often conflicted. Whether it is Hungary's Orbán, India's Narendra Modi or Italy's Silvio Berlusconi, such figures at first come across as can-do problem solvers who are at least capable of getting things done. Managers and executives find their brash, no nonsense style crude, but straightforward. Populists play on this perception, presenting themselves as prospective CEOs in chief, often using their past business success as an example of what they could achieve in public office. But are such politicians really a boon for private sector wealth creation? As researchers who have examined the economic and social dynamics of populism for more than a decade, we lay out what the data show, and it says the answer is no. Even in the case of right-leaning populists who initially claim to be pro-business, concerningly, the picture is worse when right-wing populists return for a second round in office. When supposedly pro-business populists appear again on the ballot, some business leaders see it as an opportunity. They should instead be asking what they can do to reduce company risks and bolster stability. More terms, more problems. Though there are many metrics of business growth and success, revenues, profits, social impact, employee or customer satisfaction, the price that investors are prepared to pay for ownership is a metric that is hard to contest. For our analysis, therefore, we reviewed daily stock market data from Refinitiv, comparing total returns in US dollars, including dividends, for all countries for which we have data, developed and major emerging markets, to see how markets performed under left and right-wing populists, as well as when political moderates narrowly prevail, prevailed, such as Emmanuel Macron in France against Marine Le Pen in 2017, or Joe Biden against Donald Trump in 2020. Populists were identified using criteria widespread in political science and based on external projects we have advised. Populists in this criteria are defined by three factors. They center a political strategy that divides their population between a good and righteous people and an elite or undeserving minority. They claim that they are the sole or best representative of the people, and they define democracy as requiring that the government serve the will of the people and do not accept constraints from independent institutions, oversight, or inalienable rights. To account for the forward-looking nature of market pricing, we collected data starting 6 months before a new government was elected and ending either 6 months before an election loss, or through June 2024 for those who remained in office. To ensure fair comparison, we tracked relative rather than absolute returns. That is, how a country index performed vis-a-vis equivalent markets over an identical period of time, using either a global index for developed economies or a specific index for emerging markets as appropriate. Far from growing private sector wealth, we find that equity returns under right-wing populists often prove dismal. On average, they underperform benchmarks by around a quarter during a first term in office and by half after a decade. While early years often see a brief outperformance, valuations eventually lag, as can be seen from the examples of Hungary, Poland, and the Philippines. Relative equity returns drop the longer right-wing populists are in power. While most countries see an initial increase in stock market returns after a right-wing populist is elected, this rise rarely lasts more than a few months or years. Stock market returns relative to benchmark. Index series begins 6 months prior to candidate victory in order to account for early market pricing of the expected election winner. Indeed, in almost every case where a right-leaning populist was re-elected to serve for a second or third term, whether consecutively or following a period in opposition, their country's stock market began to fall behind. While we hypothesized that right-leaning populists would be better for the market than those of the left, surprisingly, it appears there is little difference. Relative equity returns fell short in both cases, continuing to deteriorate the longer the duration that a populist is in office. By contrast, when moderate politicians beat a populist rival, relative returns keep up with the global average. Relative equity returns drop the longer both right and left-wing populists are in power, while relative market returns lag under both left and right-wing populists. The same is not true when moderate candidates prevail. Stock market returns change relative to benchmark. Index series begin 6 months prior to candidate victory in order to account for early market pricing of the expected election winner. Admittedly, when moderate candidates prevail, there is wide variation by country, ranging from France's 50% outperformance since Emmanuel Macron first beat right-wing populist Marine Le Pen in 2017 to Mexico's dismal 50% lag under the beleaguered administration of Enrique Peña Nieto, who beat left-wing populist Andrés Manuel López Obrador in 2012. These extremes reflect mean reversion following the deep discount on French earnings multiples under French President François Hollande and the high valuations left by Mexico's more investor-friendly presidents Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón. Though there is only a 7 to 8 year track record for the cases in our 25-year sample window, overall the balance remains neutral. Notably, this remains the case irrespective of whether a moderate edged out a populist challenger of the left or from the right. When non-populist leaders beat a populist in national elections, there are no clear trends for relative equity returns. In cases when moderate candidates win elections against a populist rival, and relative equity returns vary widely but show no net trend. This remains true regardless of whether the rival was a populist on the left, as in Mexico or Greece, or the right, as in France or the US. Stock market returns relative to benchmark. Index series begin 6 months prior to candidate victory in order to account for early market pricing of the expected election winner. While stock prices are an important metric for public companies, they do not necessarily reflect the broader prosperity of society. Yet, these measures reveal a similar picture. A recent study in the American Economic Review looked at economic performance under populist rule over a much longer period, spanning a full 120 years. After a 3 year honeymoon, such leaders were found to produce a 1% annual drag on growth. After 15 years, countries led by both left and right-wing populists were left with national incomes 10% lower than expected. Beyond the headline effects on economic growth, the authors also estimate that 15 years of populist rule leaves national debt up to 10% higher than otherwise, with inflationary pressures as a result. We examined this effect using monthly consumer price data from the World Bank's global database of inflation to see how price indices change from the moment populists enter office up until 12 months after their departure, thereby capturing lagging effects. On average, left-wing populists see inflation rise within 2 to 4 years. Right-leaning populists start out better, but produce a similar result by the end of their second term. Inflation increases under both right-wing and left-wing populists the longer they're in power. Whether a populist claims to be of the left or the right, they tend to value short-term gains over long-term results. Taken together, the evidence suggests that a common result, rising levels of debt and inflation, and substandard performance for markets and growth. Why do populists harm business more the longer they govern? Why do populist leaders create these economic effects? The answer may seem obvious for left-leaning populist leaders who tend to offer government giveaways to their supporters, spend on boondoggle projects, and disregard financial discipline and investor confidence. But right-leaning populists begin with business-friendly measures such as tax cuts and deregulation, initially sending growth and markets higher. For this group, what changes over time to produce results that end up harming the economy and corporations. The first challenge is that once sustained for more than a few years, these growth pumping policies invariably produce inflation, credit risk, and currency volatility. The greater danger comes in how leaders react once this market performance unravels. Instead of returning to budget discipline or ending the flow of easy money, they often resort to measures associated with populists of the left, such as challenging central bank independence, imposing exchange controls, or restricting free trade. When those backfire, third difficulty begins. They attempt to mask their failures by sabotaging the agencies of producing independent data so that they can claim their own version of the facts. Some business leaders understand these trends A June 2024 analysis found that no Fortune 100 CEO had personally donated to the Trump 2024 campaign, for example, but many failed to anticipate this reversal because they rely on heuristics such as left or right. But thinking of populists as left or right is a misunderstanding. Populists care little about ideology. What they want is power. To get it, they build their popularity by polarizing populations. Fanning division between us and them creates intense loyalty from a base of supporters who are easily convinced that things that stand in the leader's way, including independent institutions and laws, are illegitimate obstacles to the will of the majority. With the support of this base, populists centralize and personalize that power. They gain control over once independent institutions that could serve as checks, such as central banks and courts. They undermine others that could contradict their claims, like independent statistical bodies. These activities take time and are often just getting underway in early years. But when populists are in power for a while, a return to power at a later date, this increased polarization and a weakened rule of law provide few institutional constraints on their decision making. As the economies of these countries start exhibiting volatility, stock market shocks, inflation, and heightened credit risk, the normal institutions that would right the ship are unable to do their jobs. Witness, for example, Erdogan's sidelining of the central bank in Turkey and calls to limit or even eliminate the role of the US Federal Reserve in a Project 2025 policy planning document created by conservative groups to guide a second Trump administration. Disempowered, once vital agencies can at best issue warnings. But naysayers are not popular among populist leaders. Instead of changing course, these leaders tend to alter or simply refuse to report accurate statistics, leaving businesses and investors flying in the dark, leading economies to fly in the dark. Populist leaders also evade normal policy channels, preferring to take key decisions based on personal instinct. Some of those definitions are helpful by breaking outdated policy taboos, such as Donald Trump's willingness to meet with North Korea's leader directly to try to break a nuclear stalemate. However, the personalized nature of populist decision making generally causes harm, as with Modi's decision to demonetize small bills overnight. The concentration of power in a single leader and their personal network inevitably leads to increased corruption. especially in countries that had previously been less corrupt. Irregular businesses suffer as their markets get squeezed by the well-connected few. A small business elite benefits from this cronyism, of course, but only to the extent that they too can remain in favor. Populist leaders don't want potential rivals, and when a business person gets too independently powerful, these leaders have a tendency to force them out of their business positions or even from the country entirely. It is this change to the nature of governing more than individual policies that is so dangerous to business over the long term. Populists undermine the operating environment capitalism depends on, most notably free competition and a predictable rule of law.